I'm Mike Millard. I am a journalist and author, and I want to introduce you to the people who will watch this. Our guest tonight's Alan Christoper, who is a founder of psychonatural therapy, has a master's degree in transpersonal psychotherapy, and is an integral shamanic counselor. Alan's work is kind of different because it's grounded in ancient traditional lineages integrated within a contemporary psychological framework. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Okay. We have two other guests. Leo, can you fill us in?
Sure. I'm joining as an additional participant. Just happy to be here and happy to be part of this interview and this discussion. I'm really excited about Alan in general and everything that I think he stands for, but I'm about to learn more about. And I'm the director for DCRIM here in Seattle, and then also Entheo Society of Washington. But I also wanted to introduce Nadia Doe, and she's here as well. She's just gonna come in at the tail end. We might have a few questions to contribute, but she has a 501c3 starting a church, psilocybin church here in Washington State that she started. So thank you.
We're in Washington State.
Oh, Vancouver.
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 Interesting. Okay, can we start? Alan, are you ready?
I think so. I'm ready.
Terrific. Can we look at your background a little bit first? Where did you grow up, and can you give us a brief description of that?
Okay, I'm a Texan, born in Austin, but I was raised mostly in Laredo, which is on the border of Mexico. And it's also where the peyote fields are. So, growing up, kind of peyote was a part of, not directly part of the culture, but indirectly, right? And, the type of Catholicism there was also kind of very linked to plants and spirits and stuff like that. Not that anyone I knew was really into that. I was at a young age, but I was definitely, on the margins of the culture there. It was more of a machismo culture, but because of, when my friends would go hunting deer and I'd be hunting peyote.
You were fortunate.
Yeah.
What problems did you encounter in your early years?
I mean, I guess, just growing up in a place that was not really proactive about change in any way. And I was kind of very progressive, always thinking outside of the box and, transformative from a young age. Also, it's the #1 port for drugs in the world, I think. So there's a lot of the narco terrorism and cocaine and heroin, but mostly a lot of alcohol. Like, from a young age, we would go across the river to nightclubs that were just full of teenagers. Yeah. So I was doing that at the age of 14, 15. And a lot of people grew out of that, but I didn't really grow out of that. I went deeper into it in my early life. But that's really what informs the work that I do today,
I understand. What was your academic career like at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, which is a very interesting school. I've lived in San Francisco and familiar with it. How was that?
I mean, my experience there was just phenomenal. I don't know if a better education exists in the world for what I learned there, Yeah. I noticed on one of your other interviews, you interviewed Larry, and Larry and I were co-founded, ERIE, Entheogenic Research, Integration, and Education, as a student group. He took it on to be a nonprofit, but I was just there in the beginning as a student group in a classroom where the professors were not just master clinicians and professors of psychology, but also trained in indigenous medicine traditions. And so, it really is a synthesis. The school was accredited by Ralph Metzner.
Yes.
He wrote a book on every type of entheogen there is, and, was really a catalyst for fusing grounded psychology, psychoanalysis, therapy, the body, you know,
Yeah.
somatic-based mindfulness type psychotherapy with Eastern traditions, and then, you know, the medicines, and later on the indigenous kind of studies that were there at CIS as well.
He started that very early, didn't he? That's true.
Metzner?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was one of the Harvard Three with Timothy Leary, so it was when he was in college.
Yeah.
And Das.
What indigenous traditions have you pursued, and why?
Well, I guess, you know, early on it was kind of the Huichol tradition, which is the peyote tradition from Mexico.
Yeah.
And at a young age, you know, like I said, I grew up around peyote. I was reading Carlos Castaneda. And so I took trains down to what they call Wirikuta, which is, you know, where the Huichol go and harvest the peyote medicine once a year.
Yeah.
And so I started doing that. And so, but that was kind of loosely involved with the traditions. Then later on, I got involved with sweat lodge traditions, which is, you know, Plains Indian and Lakota, Dakota sweats, Sundance ceremony. And, you know, that's a whole medicine path that doesn't use entheogens necessarily. You know, there are plants, but not the kind that alter like we're used to when we use the term entheogen.
Yeah.
But that, I probably learned more from that path than any, even though it doesn't include those medicines. But I also did the Native American Church, which is an intertribal ceremony using peyote.
Yeah.
And then when I started training with the mushroom medicine and working with the mushroom, that was in the Mazatec tradition, which is from Oaxaca, the highlands of Mexico.
Right. Right.
And then through CIIS, you know, I was really blessed with working with elders from all over, but Sabomfu Some and Malidoma Some, which are from the Dagara tribe of Burkina Faso and in West Africa. So I really took a lot from them as well, which is also not like based in entheogens as we would know them, but definitely, you know, shamanism and psychology and just the way to work with people connected to the earth.
Yeah. Back to Huichol. I'm a little bit familiar with Huichol art, which is striking, beautiful.
Right. They're known for their beadwork and the yarn work.
Yeah.
Right, the hikuri, and so those are usually, you know, the yarn works are visions from their ecstatic states with the Mets.
Yeah. You've studied all these different indigenous traditions. Is there something that relates them? Is there some connective tissue there that you found?
Yeah, you know, they're all based on earth science, you know, working with the elements and how we are nature, we are an extension of the earth, and that, you know, these are considered sacraments, these entheogens, and they're not necessary, you know, their idea of spirituality is so woven within the culture, they don't necessarily see it as something other than, right? And so that therefore, like, the integration of these medicines is woven into the fabric of their daily life. And that's something that we don't have as Westerners in this contemporary culture, and which is kind of the hardest part to translate, right? That they all live in circular time, not linear time. And so there's a inherent connection that, yes, has been eroding over these more recent generations, but they're more closely connected to it than we are, whose ancestors may have been disconnected thousands of years ago.
Yeah, interestingly, Western cultures did have that connection at one time, and
exactly.
You know,
so a lot of my teachers, that they focus on ancestral wisdom as opposed to indigenous, right? Because all of our ancestors were indigenous to somewhere, and most likely they all used an entheogen, most likely the psilocybin.
Let's look a little bit now at your therapy and the things that you're doing. How does Western psychotherapy approach addiction, and how effective is that? Addiction being a problem you've come across in the early days today.
I think, like, we're seeing a huge shift in psychotherapy with like trauma work and what, you know, somatic based mindfulness, that trauma lives in the body. Now we know how trauma acts on the brain. And before that, psychotherapy was about, you know, talking, and you can't talk trauma out of the body, right? And now we know most addiction comes from trauma. At least a lot of people are aware of that now, that doing addiction work is really doing trauma work. And that trauma is not just acute trauma, but it's also cultural trauma, institutionalized trauma. You know, the cognitive dissonance that's created when we realize our education is mostly a fabrication of lies. You know, So anyhow, like I did do my practicum at a rehab for mostly lifers getting parole, and I couldn't use medicines there, right? So I definitely feel like I had my hands tied behind my back in a way, even though, you know, we were making progress with people. What the medicines can do to really get things out of the system just really can't be matched, except by some type of master body workers and energy healers.
Have you worked with veterans much? PTSD?
So I haven't a lot, but I did, you know, my first clients there that were lifers getting parole, 2 of them were ex-military. And, you know, I have worked with veterans since then. And the way I approach my work to them is kind of the way I approach it with everyone, is we first have to build the resiliency of their youth, of their childhood. So I do a lot of family systems constellations work, which is working with the epigenetics. And a lot of that is, you know, the layers of the family system as a child. The first 7 years of life and what was going on with the family then is really going to put into motion events in your life that could lead to being at war and being in trauma and not having the resiliency to really bounce back. And so that is kind of what I focus on at first.
I can see the family would play a big role in that. Is there a problem with addicts acknowledging the effects of their backgrounds and being aware of those effects?
You know, I think you could say that for a lot of people. You know, a lot of us don't realize how big of an impact our childhood has on our life as it unfolds. I think addicts are quick to blame their parents. So, you know, for some of them, it's easier. But people are always surprised when they're, you know, when we're diving into some subject matter that they think isn't affecting them anymore. Oh, I thought I already worked on that. Well, you know, it's kind of a lifetime process sometimes.
It's difficult to be aware of the effects of your family all the time, I think. Okay, let's, how does blending psychotherapy with plant medicine and indigenous knowledge lead to better results in your work?
Well, because you're working on the multiple layers of a human all at once, right? You have the physical, the psychological, the energetic, the emotional, the ancestral, you know, the epigenetics. You're increasing the neuroplasticity, using the medicines. A lot of the therapy I do to prepare people is doing some of this family constellation work, unpacking childhood, you know, giving people grounding exercises. And the medicines can just go deeper once you kind of open these doors, right? And then, you know, the indigenous wisdom, or I know you use the word knowledge, but it's really more about tapping into the wisdom of like why not to do things, not just to do things that we have the ability to do, but to really use discernment. And that nature plays a huge role in everything. Like we are nature, right? And so interacting, you know, walking barefoot is going to make a difference. Interacting with the environment is going to make a difference. And just working with the ancestors too, right? Whether it's through epigenetics on a cellular level or people are thinking of their ancestral lineage, you know, both are effective, right?
That's really our, in Western societies, cultures, that's really our big disconnect, isn't it? That at one point in our history, we were disconnected from nature pretty much. And that may have something to do with prevailing religions, that kind of thing. But I think, you know, Western culture is not very connected to nature, and indigenous culture.
No, it's connected to concrete, you know, we live in concrete and asphalt. Yeah.
It's hard to understand sometimes. a lot of people, probably most people, experience anxieties over end of life. Um, how can you help overcome that sort of thing with plant medicines? I've read some things about this. What's your take on it?
Yeah, that's something more like the medicines will do on their own, and I don't need to do a lot when it comes to that. But, you know, really it's a fear of death. Yes, when people are coming at their end of life, they might have more of a fear of death, but to really realize the fear of death is what creates pretty much every anxiety on the earth. Like everything we feel is coming from this fear of death, which creates an inability to live life.
Yeah.
Right? To be disconnected and engaged in life because there's a fear there. And it's really interesting. You know, I work with people that hate their lives. They just wish they weren't alive, yet they are afraid of death.
Yeah. That's an interesting.
So, you know, yeah.
What about depression? Depression is, I think, a common problem in this day and age. How do you approach that?
Well, yeah, I think it's the depressed people that they hate their life so much, but they're still afraid of dying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But you know, I work with that again, you know, so some kids, they don't remember ever not being depressed.
Yeah.
And so if they were born and they were already depressed, then that's something in the lineage. That's something that happened before them. Or it could have been in utero trauma,
Yeah.
right? But it could be the history of depression in the family.
Yeah.
If they remember when they were not depressed, then it's something that maybe happened, right?
There are chains that are passed down in families, aren't there, from one generation to the next?
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, they say things skip a generation and the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Those two concepts are kind of the root of my work.
Yeah. I got you. What about people who are more or less ordinary and have no great problems, are fairly well adjusted? How can plant medicines enhance the sense of wellness?
Well, you know, I've worked with professional athletes and people that are in the top of their field, and they, you know, kind of feel they've met their needs, wants, and desires, but there's still this a sense of the numinous, right? That there's something greater out there, and the medicines can do that in a way that other things can't. And what that does for a person's life is that feels like they already have everything. Now they have more to give on just an energetic level, right? They're just kind of expanded to a state where other people feel that, you know, and it's like, hey, I want what that person has. How'd you get that? Oh, well, I did this, and I don't know, I just have felt this way ever since. So yeah, and then they'll be able to help their loved ones who they know are struggling, you know, and be able to say, hey, look, this thing really helped me. Why don't you come along? Let me help you help yourself. And so that's where you're reversing the chain of trauma that comes through the lineage. Well, now you can send back a chain of love and light, you know, and get all your family members on board.
Yeah. I think that many years ago when I began experimenting with entheogens, I lived in San Francisco in the late 60s period. And I experienced a kind of connectedness that I had never known before.
Right.
And I've always felt that changed my life from that point forward. You know, this sense of connectedness
yeah, you'll get a sense of a need to be altruistic. You know, in the community, a lot of the people that my teachers worked with were very successful, but actually the medicine started saying like, hey man, you can't keep building parking lots and paving the earth. You need to like plant gardens. I know another guy who was an investment banker. He then started lending money to nonprofits, and I think he helped CIS buy their building. Right? So there is a sense of needing to give back and be of service that can come through the medicines.
Yeah. Okay, that leads us to a kind of a larger question. What can indigenous plant medicines offer modern Western civilization as a whole, in a larger sense?
Civilization as a whole. Well, I hope something. Well, patience, discipline, humble, learning to be humble, you know, we're so conditioned to know what we know that it's hard for us to learn from someone we think we know more than.
Yeah.
And that's really we need to be able to have a sense of humility and being able to admit we're wrong.
Mhm.
And I think that's why, Michael Pollan named his book How to Change Your Mind, because it's very hard to change people's mind, for people to step outside of their own thoughts, and the medicines will do that, in a way that therapy and other things can't necessarily do.
With plant medicines becoming more widespread now, probably than they've ever been, maybe more than their high point in the 60s even. Denver decriminalizing, Oakland, the state of Oregon, and now Leo and her group are working on Seattle and Washington as a whole. Can you foresee changes in society, wider changes because of this? What kind of changes would you see?
I think the changes I see are more people trying to step out of society and go live where they can grow their own food, kind of like in the 60s, right?
Yeah.
So maybe a little more of that, but I think the big movement is in medicine. I think we can reduce, the use of prescription drugs by like 80% for like psychologically prescribed drugs, right?
Yeah.
And even other, physical things. I know I have a lot of friends that are doctors that are seeing their patients use less and less prescriptions just because of edible marijuana or things like that. So once they start and people doing microdosing now with psilocybin and other things, that you're not going to need that high blood pressure medicine. You're not going to need so many of these prescription drugs, right? And so that, I think, is the biggest change that I hope to see, even though, people are being prescribed things like so rapidly that it's daunting. However, you can come off them with the help of these entheogens.
Yeah. Can you see this significantly affecting the mental health of the wider populace in time?
Well, yeah, like hopefully if we're getting people more off of these antidepressants and these Band-Aids into things that are actually healing the underlying problem.
Yeah.
But, it does take a little time and space for people to get there. But I do think there's going to be kind of a tipping point where people are just aware that these things can help and they're there, and you don't have to be afraid of them and lose that stigma.
You seem to be approaching that. I don't know, when we may get there or not, but it's we're making progress, I think.
Well, I know I've worked with a lot of adults who sent their kids away to rehab for psilocybin, and now the parents are doing psilocybin, right?
Yeah. Yep. I have one last question I have. When I look around, maybe the biggest problem that we face is climate change or ecological degeneration. Maybe the biggest long-term problem we face as a society. Can plant medicines help us address that? Do you see any way?
Well, through the sense of connection that we get through those plant medicines, and feeling that we are an extension of the earth, and this idea of being custodians of the earth, right? Of needing to take care and just reducing our use of toxins, because it's like this over toxicity and pollutants, which yes is at a grand scale level, but if we start doing things on a small level and saying no to certain products, that sense of connection, I think, is where we can affect the big term ecological disaster that we're kind of facing.
Certainly the disconnection is what enables it, I think. So I would have to think that by becoming reconnected, it has to be good, it has to help. Leo, you have any questions for us?
I always have questions, so I'm just gonna jump right in. So I took a lot of notes while you were talking, Alan, and it may just be all over the place, but had a lot of questions come up for me, and I know that we both have some questions for you. But so one thought I was having was, when we look at drugs in terms of how drugs have been demonized in certain communities, I really want to re-envision that concept of the drug war being more than just, people of color paying a price for racist drug laws, and and all of this, I really want to examine the fact that, drugs were placed in certain communities to keep them frozen or keep them imprisoned. And I feel like now when we go to certain communities and we are trying so hard to go into certain communities, communities where these medicines have been demonized and they've been lumped together with things that are very damaging and poisons that have hurt these communities. So any thoughts on bridging that division, that doing that work of letting people know in a way that hopefully is not condescending to them, but to let them know, like, maybe if you go to the reservation and you're talking to someone and they're like, oh, well, 12-step is the way, like red road is the way. And like, we're going to do our sobriety pathway in this way. And then to ask them like, well, can you reconsider? Or when you think about colonization and its impact of, these were communities that were, tied to the earth. And then it feels like Western civilization came in and destroyed that. And now we're coming, the irony that we're coming and asking them to consider what they originally were already doing and already part of. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a bit of a conundrum. There needs to be kind of a level of trust that first happens for people to be open to that. Depending on, when people are desperate, they'll try anything, but it's a shame when people have to wait for that level of desperation. But I think it needs to come from people within the community, right? And not outsiders coming in and saying, hey, we have an answer for you again. And, I've been a part of some of those communities for a long time and still am kind of an outsider in a way that maybe some of them would consider doing that with me, but a lot of them wouldn't. But because they have their own path, right? And so you just kind of have to respect people where they're at and not try to push something on people and let them come to it on their own. But it is challenging. It is.
So as far as peyote, do you have any particular thoughts on that? Because I find myself in this sea of, emotion and feelings for the political aspects of it.
Yeah, I personally don't work a lot with that, do those ceremonies anymore, because of certain reasons like that. There's just a lot of politics involved. And I don't know if politics is dehumanizing in a sense. Those are more like group ceremonies for, communities that come together and do that way, as opposed to acute healing or the kind of work that I do.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's harder when you're in a political role and people ask you to pick a side, but
yeah, but even within the peyote church, like where I'm from in South Texas, the indigenous people, they don't like the Native American church, right? Because they were there before that, and before it became an intertribal ceremony. And then there's the Huichols who also have their own opinions. So there's a lot of dissenting opinions within those medicine traditions alone, right? So, when people are looking for acute healing, it's usually not going to. Malidoma says us Westerners have a fatal attraction to the exotic. But the exotic thing is not necessarily what's going to help us. We need to be seen, and we need to be seen by our community and our ancestors. And so, what is the medicine that our ancestors used? And that, I think, is easier to integrate for people, right? And people from all over the world used mushrooms. Not people all over the world used ayahuasca. They didn't all over the world use peyote, right? Those are very specific, and that these medicines are designed to make people really thrive in the environment in which they grow. And so there's a lot where I'm from, like I won't do peyote if I'm not in the desert, because for me it's a desert medicine. I know other people feel totally differently about that, and that's fine. But That's where I feel about it, right? And so, you know, to take something out of the environment and out of the cosmology, you know, just makes things a little more messier. And so I try to encourage people to, you know, what did your ancestors do? Why don't you start there?
No, that's good to hear your thoughts on that. So another thing that came up for me was, as we look at these the experiences of these medicines or spirits, for me, I feel like there's different entities attached to each medicine, and that you're communicating with a consciousness that is specific to that medicine. That's been my experience, or that's my view. And as you're looking at the topography of the United States, like if we were to just look at the topography of the United States right now, what does it mean for people to conceive of cannabis as something that they want to interact with for healing? That may not be something that they're interacting with when they are conceptualizing that. They're not necessarily interacting with that as something that what could potentially be a consciousness, right? A consciousness that they're having a conversation with. And I feel like we don't have that in our society, that sense of communicating with God or asking God questions, or kind of like that direct conduit with God. We don't really have that sense like biblical times in terms of Western culture, or because, you know, we would have these experiences, these direct experiences with angels or with God, or, you know, we would be given direction and so forth. And I'm just wondering, in your view, do you feel like, because we have this fierce individualism and we can't think about our pain as being like our ancestors' pain, we can't think about being interconnected that way, do we also struggle conceptualizing with how would these medicines be incorporated into our culture? Because you're talking about a consciousness, you're talking about communicating with a consciousness, and maybe that's something that most humans or most people in our society can't conceptualize, and that makes them uncomfortable. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think people can conceptualize that, except that it's so overlaid with being self-absorbed. Because, you know, people talk to themselves. I hear my mom washing dishes and she talks to herself. And I say, okay, well, before we talk to ourselves, we were talking to the earth and to God. And so this is just a habit that's carried over, but we're told we're talking to ourselves because we're so stuck in our own head as Westerners these days. But if we were a few generations ago, you're talking to the earth, you're talking to the plants, to the weather, to the stars, to God, whatever, you know, to something greater than yourself. It's just now we're conditioned, oh, I'm talking to myself. Well, maybe you're not.
So a couple more questions, but I want to hand it over. As far as, do you get angry when you conceptualize like how these medicines are kept from people in terms of the rigidity of 12-step? Because, you know, I do chemical dependency work and I find it very frustrating, kind of what you spoke about in terms of, sure, you can get there with maybe energy work and these other means, but for a lot of folks, you know, it's just so much harder. And so just asking if you feel any anger there.
No, I mean, I did the 12 steps. I did them a few times, but I did a medicine ceremony with each step. You know, I had a sponsor who kind of had an idea that he knew I was working with shamanism, and he said, hey, your spiritual path is not a part of the 12 steps. That's in the traditions of the 12 step. We don't talk about that. That's why you can have Catholics and Jewish people and all different walks of, you know, religious faiths together, and they're not arguing about religion. That's probably the only organization on the planet that has that happen. So this kind of rigidness and dogma, like, you know, I never listened to people anyhow, so I just did it my way. But, you know, I was given the leniency to do it that way. He just said, hey, and this guy was a Buddhist monk and a professor, and he just knew not to ask me about what I was doing in my ceremonies. But that's how I did the 12 steps. I did them with a ceremony. And to know that Bill and Dr. Bob, you know, they were using LSD, and, you know, so if people want to stay rigid, they can stay rigid, but you don't have to stay rigid.
And then my last question before I hand it off to Nadia is this whole idea of like in the 109 measure for Oregon is the idea that there will be people that go through some basic training, but that education is not going to be a limiting factor. So these folks, you know, in essence, a lot of people when they're chatting about them online are like, well, these people will essentially be trip sitters, you know, in terms of like maybe their level of awareness or training or what have you. And so we've been having a lot of discussions within our community about, you know, what is the difference between like a shaman and a trip sitter. And as you, I guess there's like two parts of that question. The first part being, do some people feel like more aligned with the path that they would be in a position of healing other people, and that that's like a holy responsibility, and maybe some people shouldn't be doing this work with people, and just concerns you might have about that, or distinctions you might make. So the first part of my question was, do you think anyone can do this work? And the second one was about, for yourself, like, do you feel that being a leader or a healer has been a path of finding balance for yourself? Like, did you feel like it was a sense of responsibility, or was it overwhelming at times, or, you know, that kind of self-care, like just hearing more about that. So it's a two-part question. And I'm done.
Okay, maybe I'll start with the second part. Like, yeah, when I grew up reading Carlos Castaneda and eating peyote, being a medicine worker was not a career path. And because of that, I was turned into an outlaw at, you know, the age of 15 for something that I felt I knew was like a powerful thing. And now I'm an outlaw, right? And so it made me throw in the towel on society and culture in general, and made me, you know, go down the path of addiction and incarceration, which I might not have had to do if these things were decriminalized, right? And so for me to then be taken under the wing of psychedelic psychotherapists and other, you know, shamans and medicine workers, that was very integrating for me. And when then they said they saw something in me and they wanted me to carry this work on, well, obviously that gave me a purpose in life that I never really felt I had before. Why? Because the purpose I was here for was illegal and illegitimate. So that's part of like my story, but we don't live in that world anymore. It's changed now. Maybe not for the best, because everyone's running around wanting to be a shaman, and that's not, definitely trip sitters are very different. I mean, I sold acid in high school. I was a trip sitter, right? Does that mean I was healing or helping people? Maybe not, right? And that there's a difference. If people want to do healing work, then they might look for someone more than a trip sitter. If they want to, you know, experiment and have, you know, an exploration with this medicine and have an experience, okay. But I think it really comes down to the level of trauma that people are carrying. And if you're carrying a lot, then you might need someone who's trained more than, you know, being a trip sitter, which you sometimes don't know until it happens, right? And, you know, those people are, you know, like the Zendo Project is little advanced trip sitters, right? But they also know their limits. If people have some serious trauma and stuff, you find someone in there that has some kind of therapeutic background. And so, yeah, that's the answer. People are going to do what they do, and we can't stop people from doing what they do. We can only present another option of doing things in a healthier, more contained way.
Definitely. So I'm going to pass it off to Nadia for her questions. We're going to change seats. 1 second.
All right.
Hi.
Hi.
I just want to say thank you. I felt a lot of resonance in what you said in my own work. I walk a similar path to you, and that fine edge between legal and illegal, while still following the medicine path and the calling, has been challenging. So it's nice to hear you speak to it. So I only have one question, and that's, what do you see for the future for yourself and for your work? And, you know, what's next for you? What's the big picture?
Well, I mean, I left the States as soon as I got out of school. You know, I already went to prison for entheogens. I don't want to do it again. So I had a center in Mexico, then I had one in Costa. Right now I'm kind of in between with the pandemic, everything, you know, kind of came to a halt. I'm not in Costa Rica, I'm in Mexico again, but I'm near the border where people can come very easily. You fly to San Diego, and so, you know, we pick people up at the airport and bring them here to Mexico, where they make their way here. And I'm still doing Ibogaine detox, not always with Ibogaine, but I do work with addicts, people that are wanting to detox. And I also work, you know, with high functioning people. Sometimes it's people with trauma, sometimes it's psycho-spiritual. But yeah, I do what I do. I would, you know, one day like to have a center again, but when it comes to addiction and, you know, only did a 7 to 10 day detox program because recovery is a long-term process, and that requires a lot of experts, right? And that requires a lot of money that I don't have right now. And so, you know, eventually one day it would be great to have a staff and a center, but I need to do that at a level of professionalism that doesn't really exist right now.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
You're welcome. I mean, it exists, but it doesn't exist all under one roof, you know.
Right. Right. No,
Except maybe Takiwasi.
And so your primary medicine is Ibogaine or Iboga?
No, no. It is for treating, for detoxing, Ibogaine. I'm mostly trained and worked a lot with the psilocybin, but in the last couple of years, it's been more 5-MeO from the bufo.
Okay.
Yeah, that bufo alvarius toad, because it works in a quicker way. It doesn't unravel people in quite the way that the other medicines do, and so you don't need as much time. I don't need as big a container to hold people from a beginning process to the ceremony to the integration process. It works very differently. It can flush the nervous system of trauma in a way where you don't even ever have to talk about that trauma. And so that's where I've been doing the constellations with the bufo, with some energy work, maybe some combo as well, you know, clearing people's system out like that. And then the therapeutic integration on a weekly basis afterwards.
Awesome.
Do you want to tell them a little bit about your
No, it's okay. I'll give it back.
How about you? What's
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about your project?
Yeah.
Is that appropriate to add?
So I actually started down this path with ayahuasca, and I had a very traumatic experience with it at a retreat center. But a few months later, a Shipibo maestro showed up in Florida, and I started doing training with him and learned the basics of the Amazonian plants and how to work in ayahuasca. But he taught us in a non-traditional way. He taught us in a way that allowed me to bring it to the Western perspective. And then over the years, I actually transitioned into mushrooms because the spirit that you work with in ayahuasca, she came to me and said that she didn't want to come through that doorway anymore. She wanted to come through the psilocybin doorway. So the medicine told me to relocate to Vancouver, Washington, and an attorney appeared and helped me do the whole church documentation, the DEA exemption, and you know, the path just sort of lined up, and the more I surrendered, the more it lined up. And so I have my church in Vancouver right now, and I train facilitators in the shamanic capacity to work with psilocybin. So in a very spiritual, listen to the medicine sort of way. And it's been wonderful.
Well, I really hope you share that story with more people, because I know so many people that say how challenging ayahuasca ceremonies were for them, and they didn't know if it was working, and they still did it for years. And then they switched to mushrooms, and it's just softer on them. Like I said, it's in our ancestral lineage, and it's not this fatal attraction to the exotic. You know, that medicine, it has the most complex cosmology associated to it, and it's a very, you know, it's one that's very far away from our modern Western world. here in the U.S. So I really encourage you to share that with people. I think that would be helpful.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. So we're probably gonna end the recording here unless you have something else that you'd like to add, but we really have appreciated your meeting with us and
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Alan, tremendous to meet you, and thank you very much. It's great chatting with you.
You're welcome. Keep up the good work.
Absolutely, you too.